up, everybody? Following my bridle awareness series, I received several questions from people asking specifically about slider down aerials. I'm making this video as kind of a bonus video to go along with that series to put a cap on everything slider down in regards to bridle awareness, and then I'm going to move into talking about some other topics. First thing to keep in mind is that this is not a tutorial. I don't want anybody to watch this video and run out and just start doing slider down aerials. This is more intended for people that are either doing it themselves already, or you're starting to think about doing them and you're just doing your homework. There are some really good tutorials out there specifically on some of the tricks that I'm going to be talking about in this video, and I will provide links and reference those when we get there. Bridle wraps are a major concern when it comes to slider down aerials, and while each aerial is going to have its own unique set of variables and things to consider, there are typically three things that are very important to consider regardless of which one that you're doing. The first is going to be your body position or your pitch timing. The second one is going to be your speed of rotation, and the third is going to be wind considerations. All three of these areas kind of have to work together in unison in order to put yourself in a position to have a good jump and not potentially cause a bridle wrap. Many times over the years, I've seen scenarios where somebody is told, hey, just pitch when you're looking at whatever, and then the person goes off, pitches when they're looking at what they've been told to look at, and then they have a bridle wrap because they ended up rotating too fast. Equally, I've seen people go off with perfect pitch timing, perfect speed of rotation, and the winds were the wrong direction for the kind of aerial that they were choosing to do, and they ended up with a bridle wrap. So like what I was saying, all of these three things kind of have to work together in unison, and that's what I'm going to be talking about throughout this video. It's important to note here that every object has its own unique set of variables to take into consideration when planning a jump. In this video, when I talk about wind considerations specifically, I'm only referring to bridge jumps and for when people are first learning whatever trick. It should seem obvious that when I say a tailwind is favorable for a gainer, that I'm not saying to go and do a gainer off of a cliff in a tailwind. I could make other analogies for all the other tricks on different objects, but I just want to say that at the beginning so it's very clear. Once you have a particular area dialed, you can start to adjust your speed of rotation and your pitch timing to accommodate for whatever the winds are doing. For example, if you were doing a gainer in a headwind off the bridge, you can actually pitch a little bit later so that your legs are clear of the danger zone, so to speak. But when people are first learning it, I don't think that that's necessarily a good idea. So don't start playing with things like that until you're very, very comfortable with whatever trick that you're planning to do. I also don't reference crosswinds in this video. As a blanket statement, I don't think that doing stowed barrel rolls or any kind of handheld aerial is a good idea in any type of crosswind. If you are going to be doing a stowed front flip or gainer, I don't think a right to left is a good idea because it's going to blow the bridle and pilot you back towards your body. You can do a front flip or a gainer if the wind is coming from the left to the right. You just run the risk of having an off-heading. Another thing to keep in mind is your head position. If you watch any gymnastics tutorial out there, you'll always hear coaches say keep your chin down and your head straight. You'll never hear them say throw your head back and arch as much as possible. Anytime people are doing rotations in gymnastics, they're typically speeding up rotation by bending their knees or pushing harder with their legs and then bending their knees. They're never throwing their head back to try to help with that. I've actually seen some coaches take a tennis ball and put it in underneath the chin, and the person tries to just keep their chin down. In this position, just keeping a neutral head, you can still look up and you can still look down depending on what trick you're going to be doing. Starting with gainers, a really common cue that you'll hear from people is pitch when you can see the ground. And while this isn't necessarily a bad cue, it does assume that you have a good head position. For example, if this is me and my head is here and my feet are here, if I'm in a good head position and I'm essentially looking this way, the ground and the water should start to come into view when I get to about here. If I pitch at this angle, my body will continue to rotate away and I will fall away from the bridle and pilot chute and settle into the harness. In contrast to that, if my neck is arched super hard, I could still be in a vertical position and be able to see the ground underneath me. And this time, if I throw in this angle, there's a potential that the bridle and pilot chute could interact with my legs. In terms of rotation speed, ideally when we pitch, we rotate around and we hit the end of the lines right as we're vertical in the harness. For this reason, deployments are often very comfortable when we're doing gainers, and that's part of the reason why when people start doing them, they just want to keep doing them all of the time. Figuring out how fast you need to throw your rotation is kind of a trial and error thing in the beginning. Oftentimes people will throw them too fast and over rotate, which is actually better than under rotating. Getting stuck on your back can be a very dangerous thing, and if you do pitch while on your back, you could induce some kind of a body wrap, which could cause issues. In terms of wind considerations, ideally we're going to have no wind or a bit of a tailwind. In a no-wind scenario, after we pitch, everything's going to get pulled straight up over our head as we rotate into the deployment, and on a tailwind, as we pitch, the bridle and pilot chute are going to get pulled forward in front of us and not going to be a concern. Concerns start to arise if we do them in headwinds, whereas even if we pitch on time and we have a good rotation speed, the bridle and pilot chute can get blown back into your legs. Chuma actually made a really good tutorial on doing gainers. He goes into a lot more detail than I've covered here. Should be up on the screen right now. I'll also put a link to that video in the description, and I highly encourage you guys to check it out. Slider down front flips are a lot less common than gainers, and part of the reason is that they're a little bit more challenging to learn. Our pitch window is a lot shorter and it's extremely punishing to mistakes. If you under rotate and pitch too early, say on your back, you run the risk of having some kind of a bridle wrap, and if you over rotate, you're going to be head down on the deployment and get snapped back into the harness, and it can really hurt. I've heard a lot of times about people go out and try a front flip and they actually get injured just trying it once, and they have to sit out for a couple of days and they're very reluctant to try it again. For this reason, I think it's a really good idea to do everything that you can to actually learn them slider up before you bring them back to slider down, and things will go much smoother for you. In terms of pitch timing, typically we want to pitch after we have fully completed the rotation and we're kind of in a seated position. The speed of the rotation should be that once we reach that seated position, we can extend our arms and our legs and end up in a standing position as we hit the bottom of the lines. If we can get the timing on this right, the opening should be fairly similar to that of a gainer in terms of you're just standing straight up and down in the harness as everything takes load. Wind considerations are the opposite to that of a gainer. So again, doing it in zero wind is completely fine, but ideally we want there to be a bit of a headwind, so as we pitch, it blows the bridle and pilot chute back away from your body. If we're in that seated position and we pitch and there's a tailwind, it can blow the bridle and pilot chute in front of you and put it under your arm, again causing a bridle wrap. Again, Chuma has a great video tutorial on doing front flips. Should be up on the screen and the link is in the description. Bar rolls are a little bit less scary to get into than front flips and gainers because we don't have to go upside down. The vast majority of people when doing barrel rolls will rotate to their left, so after you exit, your pilot chute is going to end up pointing in the same direction that you're pushing, as opposed to if you rotate to your right, the pilot chute is going to be pointing back at the exit. I only know a couple of people that are able to do it that way, slider down successfully, and I generally just wouldn't recommend it because it makes your pitch window a lot smaller and the chances of having a body wrap with it are a lot higher. So the vast majority of people are going to, let's say I'm going to exit this way, you'll jump off to the side, rotate onto your back, and it's super cool because you get to look up at the exit point, you can see all your friends looking at you, and it's a very different perspective than doing any other kind of trick. When you're on your back, you can reach and grab the pilot chute, and once you kind of hit 90 away from the exit point, you can throw your pilot chute back up towards it and then continue the rotation around, ideally deploying in a belly to earth orientation, and you load both risers at the same time. If you over rotate, you you tend to just have a left off heading, and on the extreme version of that, you might end up putting yourself into line twists if you actually rotate too quickly. Again, they can be a relatively easy buy-in in terms of not being as scary as the other ones, but they can be quite difficult to do really well. Wind considerations on barrel rolls are not necessarily as critical as they are on front flips and gainers, and which one is more favorable kind of depends on the technique that you're using. I know some people that like to jump off kind of in a more head high position when they're doing barrel rolls. If you're going to do it this way, I think it's preferable to have a headwind, and if you're more on the side of jumping off in a belly to earth orientation, I think it's more favorable to have a tailwind. Again, there's a little bit of nuance to this. I'm just kind of giving some general recommendations, and once again, Chuma has a great video tutorial on barrel rolls from start to finish, so I definitely encourage you to check that out. There are also handheld variations of gainers, barrel rolls, and front flips, and before you venture into playing around with those, I think it's important to first be very competent at just flat and stable handheld jumps, so that you're very comfortable exiting with your bridle and pilot chute already exposed as you're jumping, and just being mindful of all of that kind of stuff, as well as being competent with the stowed variation. You typically want to develop both of those skills separately before you start to combine them and add more complexity to the jump. At the time of this recording, I'm not aware if there are any tutorials for the handheld variations. If one becomes available at a later point, I'll put the link on the screen. But for now, if these are something that you want to get into, I would highly recommend you just contact somebody who's good at doing them and get some technique tips from them. A handheld gainer is typically called a tweener, and while I don't want to get into any of the individual technique stuff, one thing that I think is very important to point out is that after you have your handheld prepped, you want to have the bridle coming out the bottom of your hand as opposed to the top. On every other handheld variation or just normal handheld jumps, we always want to have the bridle coming out the top of our hand, but this time, because we're doing essentially an underhanded throw in between the legs, we want the bridle to be running out the bottom so that it can feed out clean. Personally, I like to have the pilot chute prepped in the same way as it would be if I was going stowed, as opposed to a traditional handheld setup, just because I feel like it feeds out cleaner from an underhanded throw, but lots of people do it the traditional way without issue. Another thing that I personally like to do with tweeners is to upsize my pilot chute. You're essentially doing a go and throw. You're only taking about a second, if even that, when doing it correctly. So if you're going to be doing that with a 42, it can tend to tow for a little while before it starts to do anything, even if your rotation speed and pitch timing is good. So personally, I like to put a bigger pilot chute on. In terms of pitch timing, we're either going to pitch when we're directly on our back or slightly head low. So this would be my head looking up at the exit point, this would be my feet, and we're going to throw the bridle and pilot chute up in between our legs. The speed of rotation should be fairly similar to a gainer, if not a little bit slower. Personally, I like to jump off as if I'm almost trying to stall it on my back, but just not quite as slow. In terms of wind considerations, ideally we're going to have a tailwind, so as we throw the bridle and pilot chute up in between our legs, everything gets carried away from our body and we rotate away from it. A headwind, again, is a typical no-go, because even if we pitch on time, it can blow the bridle and pilot chute back in between your legs and cause some kind of entanglement. Handheld front flips are very, very uncommon. I only know a couple of people that have ever actually done them, and I just wanted to briefly touch on them. All of the same rules apply as a front flip in general, only this time, as we're on our back and we're looking back up at the sky, you can throw the bridle straight up above your head. If you are going to be doing these in any kind of wind, ideally you want to have a headwind, so it's going to blow the bridle and pilot chute away from your body. All of the considerations that came into traditional handheld jumps as well as front flips are kind of being combined here. Handheld barrel rolls are pretty uncommon as well, but they've been getting more and more common in the last couple of years. Generally, the same things apply as with barrel rolls and handheld jumps, you're just putting both of them together. You'll often see people run off, they'll look back at the exit point when they've turned 90, they throw the bridle and pilot chute up towards the exit point and then rotate into the deployment. In terms of wind considerations for these, again, I don't think a tailwind or a headwind is super critical, but it's definitely something to take into consideration. Having a camera on your head can also be something to really consider and be very mindful of if you are going to be doing jumps like this. Alright guys, I hope this gives you all a little bit more to think about in terms of bridle management when we're talking about slider down aerials, specifically around pitch timing, speed of rotation, and wind considerations. Watch all the tutorials that I recommended throughout the video, keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.